Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for the orphans and widows in distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Please be seated. There are some days that I feel like the soundtrack to my life is bad news. I'm an avid consumer of information. I begin pretty much every morning by turning on the NPR news updates, listening to the sort of 10-minute overview of what new atrocities befell us over the course of the night before. Over the course of a day, I might listen to multiple news-related podcasts while I'm making breakfast, cooking dinner, brushing my teeth, or mowing the lawn. I check multiple news sources over the course of the day, devouring articles, opinion pieces, both thoughtful reflections on what's happened in the world, as well as instant knee-jerk reactions. And if I'm honest with myself, most of it leaves me feeling like there's a cloud of bleak news that's hanging over me like wildfire smoke. I think of the headlines of this summer, just really the past few weeks. Whether it's fires out burning across the western United States, an assassinated president and devastating earthquake in Haiti, the continued genocide of Uyghurs in China, COVID numbers and hospitalizations ticking up across the country, ICU beds again filling beyond capacity, civil war in Ethiopia, devastating floods in Germany, a UN report that the effects of climate change are a little bit closer at hand than we even projected. Crowds of migrants seeking refuge at our southern border. And then, these past couple weeks, there were the devastating images and reports coming out of Afghanistan. The Taliban returned to power. Thousands of Afghans desperate to escape their country, to find sanctuary pretty much anywhere else. Desperate for a glimmer of hope for escape. People clinging to the landing gear of aircraft, trying to get out of the country. Despondent children afraid of what the future will hold. 13 American service members dead in a single blast, along with dozens of Afghans. All in one summer, all in the course of just a few weeks. It's nothing new. That bad news always rises to the surface. Whether it's political turmoil, war, failed governments, repressive regimes, natural disasters, famines, unrest in the streets, hatred and bigotry. We're fed a steady diet of the worst ways that human beings treat one another. And some of that may be tempered by stories of hope and resilience. I think it's good to seek those out. The stories of laughter and joy. But most days, at least for me, it feels like the darkness suppresses the light, threatens to overcome it. Both of our readings today, from the Epistle of James and the Gospel of Mark, ask us to consider what we take into ourselves, whether that's the word that we hear, food that we eat, all the things that we take into our beings, and what effect what we take in has on us. They set up contrasts between what we receive externally from the world and what is happening within us internally, and how we live lives in response to that external world. Our reading from Mark features this debate between Jesus and a group of Pharisees. They challenge Jesus and his followers for failing to follow the customs of the ancestors, of ritual hand washing, and chastise those followers for eating with unclean hands. The debate is shaped by this worldview that puts a heavy emphasis on things being pure or impure, clean and unclean, and categorizes the world into those absolute groups. The Pharisees live in fear of coming into contact with anything that might be seen as unclean. For them, a life well lived is a life avoiding impurity, of taking in anything into themselves that might go against God's will, God's law. And that's what alarms them about Jesus' followers. They just don't seem to care. And in the next part of that conversation, Jesus challenges these Pharisees to move beyond these absolute categories of clean and unclean as they may be found in the world. For him, those are the wrong categories. Because more important than what it is that we take into ourselves, into our bodies, into our hearts, and whether those are the right things or not, is what we put out into the world. That if our emphasis is solely on what we are receiving externally, we miss the point. Listen to me, all of you, and understand, he says. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. We can't wall ourselves off from the messiness of the world. We take it all in. We have to. We have to confront the reality of the times that we live in, the experiences of people around us. That means receiving all of it, the good, the bad, the violent, the ugly. And we can't prevent it from affecting us. To face the reality of the world around us is to confront evil and cruelty, right alongside kindness and love. But what is within our control is how we respond to it. And that's what Jesus is concerned about. And that's what the epistle of James that was our first reading focuses on. It challenges us not to be hearers of the word alone, but to be doers of it. To not be passive actors in this life, letting everything that happens out there wash over and fill us. But to be active participants, to engage fully with the world around us. Our faith demands us to respond both to the word of God that is revealed to us, as well as to the world that we live in, and all the information that we take in about it. And in his lines about what makes up true religion, James is telling us that any religion that fails to inspire a more full engagement with the world is not true religion. We take in so much bad news. Seeing the world around us today, it would be easy to give in to despair or to cultivate a sort of cynicism about the people around us, the systems and institutions that we move and live through and within. Be easy to become jaded, to kind of want to just give up on it all. Despair can feel like a sort of escape, a way out. If we expect less of people, then there's less room for disappointment. If we treat disaster and tragedy as inevitable, it could help us cope when they happen. We're no longer surprised. But that's a pretty short-sighted coping mechanism. Jesus warns us that it's not what we take in that defiles us, but what comes out of us. In God's eyes, what's important isn't what we receive from the world, but how we let that news shape how we live our lives. To give in to despair and to believe the bad in humanity will outweigh the good is to deny God's presence in the world. To see the bad in the world and to believe that it's inevitable is to deny God's power to transform. So what do we do with all that bad news? How do we live in the light of tragedy and loss around us? In our reading from James, we're reminded of what's at the heart of true religion. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. The antidote for all the bad in the world is to persist in doing good. In Mark's gospel, we're told that how we live matters. The way to avoid despair, of being crushed by the bad news that is out there, is living with the faith that things can and will be otherwise. To follow Christ means seeking the good and being the good. Even the smallest act of love, an act that will never make the news headlines, or rise to the surface in the face of so much suffering has meaning. Every time we act out of love towards ourselves, towards our neighbors, towards strangers we encounter on the streets, we assert ourselves against so much of what we take in. We send a message that something else is possible, that good can and will prevail, that the goodness of human beings and all of creation can rise against all of the ills and evils that we see around us. One of the most moving stories that I've heard in the past couple of weeks was an interview I heard with a young Uyghur woman, a woman who had immigrated at a young age, relatively young age from China, but still had vivid memories of growing up under an increasingly repressive regime that sought to silence her people. And she witnessed family member after family member and friend after friend being sent to re-education camps, never to return home. And on top of that was the grief of losing her homeland. They made the necessary flight out of China to America and live here now, but she still remembers vividly that homeland that she knew, that she grew up in. This is a woman who would have every reason to give into despair, to see the worst in humanity, to feel like there is no hope. And yet, over the course of this interview, she articulated the hope that she has for herself, for her younger siblings, for her family, and the life that lies ahead of them. And part of that hope came from the words of her father, who himself was a Uyghur activist and a poet. His name is Tahir Hamut Izgil, and this is one of the poems that she pointed to that he wrote. And in the form of his poems tend to be incredibly, really short, just a few poignant lines. And that's kind of the structure that this one takes. He writes this: "How miraculous that we keep on, for it makes no sense. That is to say, we are miraculous. How miraculous that we keep on, for it makes no sense. That is to say, we are miraculous." In these brief lines, he acknowledges how bleak the world around him is, but refuses to give in to despair. He finds hope in the resilience of people around him, that nonsensical resilience they show and a willingness to continue on in the face of all the odds. It is not enough to be hearers of the word, but doers. God calls us to action in the face of sorrow. God calls us not to be defined by what has happened, but by what could be. God calls us not to see ourselves as helpless in the face of all that we struggle to make sense of: death, violence, bigotry, oppression, but to act where we can, to bring love into the world where we are, to reach out to our neighbors. Even the smallest actions have meaning, because those simple acts of love build a monument to another way, a faith that someday things will be otherwise. The light overcomes darkness, that God is here, present with us, holding the world in love, bringing us out of despair into hope, from sadness to joy, from conflict to peace. On this day, may we hold on to that hope. Amen.